So welcome again, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about insect identification, and this is going to be an introduction to this topic, as we could spend lots of different classes delving into different groups of insects, as we'll see. But I hope this is a nice introduction, and if you're newer to insect ID, that you learn something, as well as those who have had some experience in insect identification. Hopefully you also build upon your knowledge as well. So welcome. If we haven't met before, my name is Madeline Potter. I'm a faculty specialist with the University of Maryland Extension at the Home and Garden Information Center. And my specialty is in entomology and integrated pest management. So today marks our second class for our plant diagnostic training series. Each class will take place the second Wednesday of each month, September through November, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, always virtually through Zoom, and every class will be recorded. Here's our schedule. So today on October 9th, we're going to be talking about insect identification. If you missed the first class on September 11th, diagnosing plant problems, make sure you do watch that recording for that information. And then our last class will be next month, November 13th. We'll talk about integrated pest management and working with the public. So people have been asking if the recordings are posted other than the emails I've been sending out. They are posted if you go to the University of Maryland Extension Master Gardener State Office website. Here's a little trail that you can follow and reference in terms of what links to click and what pages to visit. It's under the continuing education page for this Master Gardener State Office page, and you'll find recorded webinars, online classes, and resources toward the bottom of that page to find the recording. If we have time after class today, I'd be happy to share my screen and actually point out where this all is on the internet if you would like to know where they are being housed. So when we start our programs, we always put up our program assurance statement and our Injustice for All poster, letting you know that if you have any questions about the accessibility of any of our University of Maryland Extension programs, that you can reach out to me or any of the contacts listed on this poster. So as we get started, I'm going to launch a quick pre-quiz. It's going to be 4 questions. No pressure. This is just a little knowledge check-in before we delve into today's topic. So I'm going to launch that now. So again, just 4 questions. For 3 of the 4 questions, you can even respond with an unsure as your answer. Now, if you have any technical difficulties today, you don't see the poll on your screen for whatever reason, don't worry about it. This is just a check-in. Unfortunately, we won't be able to help all of you with the technical difficulties through Zoom. So just if it pops up on your screen, you're able to fill it out pretty smoothly, then go ahead and do that. If it's not popping up for you, no worries. We'll take another minute or 2 for you to fill that out if you're doing so. And as we're going through today's presentation, feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function down below, or maybe up at the top of your screen, depending on how you're viewing in your Zoom format or window. So we recommend putting your questions in that Q&A function versus the chat, because a lot of comments could be going through the chat. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll be sure to address them at the end of today's presentation. If for any reason you have to leave the presentation early, or if we go a little bit later than 1 p.m. and you want to know what the questions and answers were, again, today's presentation will be recorded so you can reference those at a later time. Okay, if you're still filling out that pre-quiz, feel free to continue to do so. We'll go ahead and continue on. So an outline of today's topics, we're going to be talking about an introduction to insects, insect morphology, getting into common insect groups and their traits, and then we'll conclude with identification tools and tips. Let's start with an introduction to insects. So today's story starts with insects, which makes sense, right? We're learning about insect and mite identification. So where do insects fall in terms of all of the living organisms that we have here on this planet? We can take a look at this by looking at classification, taxonomic hierarchy. You might remember this as we think back to some of our science courses. Maybe we memorize some sort of abbreviation to remember the order from kingdom to species. And so on the left side of your screen, what you'll see is kingdom starting at the very top. So this is a broad categorization of our living beings. And as we go down through phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, species is the most specific out of these categories that we're seeing here when we're talking about a particular organism. So we might be used to the term of taxonomic name or scientific name. That's when we're combining the genus and the species together to get a specific classification. So where do insects lie as we look at these different groupings? So we'll start with kingdom. And so here are our major kingdoms that we have categorizing living organisms on the planet. And so if we look at our bottom right, insects fall into the kingdom of Animalia, commonly known as animals. Now, as we go to phylum, beginning to narrow down, we have different major phyla we can see on the screen here. These aren't all of them. These are some of the species-rich ones that fall into this kingdom of Animalia. And what we'll zoom in on, you can probably spot on your screen, the monarch butterfly. So we're going to be talking about the phyla of arthropoda. This is what our insects belong to. Now we're going to go down half a step to subphyla before we get to class. And we stop here because under arthropoda, we can focus on hexapoda, which our insects are going to belong to, but we're also talking about mites today. Now, mites aren't insects, but they are arachnids. And so they fall under this other subphyla that we call Chelicerata. And Chelicerata includes things like spiders and mites. So we are going to be talking about mites at the end of today's presentation, but the majority of things we're talking about, insects, belong to hexapoda. For hexapoda, we're talking about classes, so next narrowing down, we have Insecta and Ectognatha. And so we're probably a good guess here. We're talking about Insecta. We're talking about insects for our class. As we get to our order groupings, there are many different insect orders, but these are the major key 6 that we can commonly find out in our green spaces, especially when we're talking about plant diagnostics. So today we're going to be delving into each of these orders or groups of insects and talking about some major traits to learn how to identify them. And so we can see them on our screen here. So we have different order names we're going to walk through. And in parentheses is what we commonly refer to insects in this order as. So for example, on the top left, we have the order of Coleoptera. And we commonly call these insects beetles. So we'll walk through some of these a little bit later. And we can get even more specific. We won't go into identifying families today, but as an example, we'll follow the line of the order of Coleoptera or beetles. And here are some of the major families of Coleoptera, as well as what they're commonly called. We can continue down this track if we zoom in on Coccinellidae, which is a family of beetles that we generally call ladybugs or ladybird beetles. We can zoom in on different genera. So different genera of our coccinellids. And then we can even get more specific looking at species for the specific genus of Coccinella. So just showing here, we can get even more specific with our identification. Today, we're going to focus in on that order grouping to build upon our skills. But typically, the more specific we can get, the better in terms of identification, plant diagnostics, in terms of sustainable pest management. So when we're talking about insects, we're talking about this class of insecta. And insects make up 80% of all life on Earth. So they're very abundant. Whether we know it or not, they are all around us. And a lot of our insects are pretty small and do go unnoticed. Now, they're not only very abundant, but they're also extremely diverse. So far, the ones that we have discovered and described are approximately 1 million insect species. But we predict there's at least 9 million more insect species that we haven't described or discovered yet. I love to point this out to people, especially young people who might be interested in STEM, because this is a field that we need more people in, and there's a lot more to be explored, which is really exciting. Now, why do we have all these insects? Why are there so many different species out there? What are they doing? Now, insects have a lot of different roles within our ecosystems, and these roles are vital to the function of a lot of our systems in our food webs. These are just some roles and examples that we can see here, such as pollination, decomposition, pest control, and even a major food source or nutrition source. I'm going to flash up on the screen some really interesting statistics that you can reference later in terms of putting into perspective the importance of these roles within our systems, whether that be globally, in the United States, or in North America. Now, what about pest insects? I get asked about this a lot. Now, a lot of people tend to have a negative connotation when you talk about insects in general, which is understandable. Excuse me. I know that I've had some bad instances when I was younger. I will say I wasn't always an insect lover when I was younger, before college. I did not like insects at all. I would scream if I found one in my room. But once I took a course on them and began to learn more and more about them, I got very curious and learned about all the different species and diversity that's out there. But we tend to focus a lot on the pests because they bring out the negative experiences, and those we tend to remember more, unfortunately. But if we look at the data that we have, only about 1 to 3% of all insect species are considered pests. So a very small portion compared to all of the beneficial insects that we have out there. Now, when we're talking about the importance of insect identification, today's topic comes down to all of these different really important beneficial insects that we have out there, and the importance of knowing that they're there and identifying them and being supporters of their different life cycles. And this is because the data that we're seeing and the track that we're currently on with climate change and global warming, we could have up to 80% loss in biomass of important insect pollinator taxa. This is just of the pollinators. We just saw the other important roles like decomposers and pest controllers. But if we're just even looking at pollinator taxa, we are on track to lose about 80% of their biomass, which is really crazy. And then if we look over on our right, we can see some of the reasons why we are losing biodiversity, not only of our insects, but also other wildlife as well. I really love this graphic we can see on the right side of our screen by a recent paper titled Death by a Thousand Cuts. So something to definitely reference if you haven't seen it before. So it's important to be informed when it comes to managing our not only our plants but our pests because of this loss in biodiversity. A lot of it can stem from pesticide use or uninformed pesticide use. And so it's really important before we take action, before we use control measures against pests, that we know what insect we have, because not all insects are pests. Now, a lot of people know the common ones like our beautiful butterflies and our bees. Those could be our good insects, but there are many other species that are extremely important as well that might be lesser known or lesser identified or recognizable. Not all pests need to be controlled. Our herbivorous insects have important roles, even if that's to feed other animals like our native birds. Caterpillars, for instance, are a really important food source for a lot of our native bird species. And when it comes to just having a few pests in our landscape, the more sustainable tactic a lot of the times is to leave them be and to allow the natural predators and parasitoids to come in and to control their populations. Also, not all control measures work for all insects and mites, especially when we're talking about sustainable control measures. A lot of people will reach for very broad spectrum control measures like broad spectrum chemicals, which means they'll take out just about any insect. And that isn't sustainable because they can harm our beneficial insects like our pollinators. So when we're looking at more sustainable targeted control measures, it's really important to know what insect we're working with, to know what control measure to select. And that also lends to knowing the insect species in its life cycle and phenology, its timing throughout the different seasons. So we know when to apply that targeted control to get the most effective control and the most sustainable control, because some of our insects are more vulnerable at different life stages, and they may be in different areas of our landscape at different times of the year and different parts of their life cycle. So all really important things to know. That leads us into insect morphology as we begin to learn about recognizing insects. So what makes an animal an insect? A lot of people will use the general term insect or bug when they're describing any sort of creepy crawly thing they find on the ground, like say our pill bugs or roly-polies or millipedes. But all those things aren't insects. So what really is an insect? So we're going to be talking about traits that make an animal an insect when we're looking at the adult stage of our insect. And there are three main traits. As we're looking at our insects, we'll learn today it's important to get different angles and viewpoints and perspectives of an insect's body because some traits can only be seen from certain angles. So for this first trait, we're going to look at a dorsal view and a ventral view of our example beetle we see here. This is one that belongs to the family Buprestidae, one of our metallic wood-boring beetles. And the first trait is insects have three main body parts. And we'll take a look at that here. The first is the head. Second body part is our thorax. And then the third is our abdomen. So putting that all together, we have our head, our thorax, and our abdomen. As we can see with our example beetle on our screen, it isn't perfectly sectioned off where we can easily spot those three sections. And so that's why I included two different perspectives here. So when we flip this beetle over, we can see these different sections and how they are arranged. Now, since our insects are extremely diverse, they've evolved in different morphologies and body arrangements, these three sections are not always easy to spot, and they have been arranged and put together in different ways. So I just wanted to give this example here to show the three body sections are there, but they may not always be easily recognizable. The next trait we'll take a look at is insects have two antennae total. So we can see those at the top of our beetle's head here. And then our third trait, insects have 6 legs total, or we can say 3 pairs of legs. So our example with our millipedes or say our centipedes have way more than 6 legs, and so they are not considered an insect. So putting that together, our 3 main traits is this combination of 3 main body regions, 2 antennae, and 6 legs total. Some other traits that our insects have are wings. Now, not all of our insects have wings. This can also vary by the life stage of a particular species. So an insect could either have 0, 1, or 2 pairs of wings total. Like with our beetle here, we can visibly see the 1 pair, the top pair of wings. And if we were to open these beetle wings up, we can see the bottom pair. So we see our beetles have 2 pairs of wings total. And then another trait is an exoskeleton. So insects have an exoskeleton. It's like having the skeleton on the outside of the body. It's protective. It helps to protect the insect's internal body parts as well as to keep things like moisture retention, temperature regulation, and so on, versus some of our other animals like us and horses, which have an endoskeleton, so a skeleton on the inside of our body. Now, other than these traits that make something an insect, there are other distinguishing traits that we can observe when we're talking about insect identification. And we can see on the left side of our screen, we're going to be talking about mouth parts, antenna, wings, and legs. So mouth parts, just like the different body regions, have evolved in very different forms depending on the species and the function that a particular species uses these mouth parts to feed. And so this little diagram here, definitely something you can check out later if you want to look at the different colored and abbreviated sections to see that different parts can be rearranged to form different types of mouth parts. And so some of our main different types of mouth parts include these four, the first being chewing mouth parts. So we can see some examples on our right of what these chewing mouth parts can look like for things like our beetles, our grasshoppers, even our roaches, as we can see a Madagascar hissing roach in this little video here, chewing on a cucumber. And generally with our chewing mouth parts, these insects have well-developed functional mandibles. So these are the serrated areas they can look like with different insects, and these are used to chew up material, whether that be plant material or other organisms. Next, we have piercing sucking mouth parts. Now, these mouth parts are arranged into a straw-like mouth part used to typically pierce some sort of tissue, could be plant tissue, could be an organism's tissue, and to extract liquid from that organism. So we can see some examples like our cicada here with its straw-like mouth part that feeds from plant juice. We have our wheel bug on our right, which has a thicker straw-like mouth part to pierce other insects and suck up their insides, as well as some examples on the bottom of what these different piercing sucking mouth parts can look like. Next, we have siphoning, classic examples for our butterflies and our moths. Looks like a giant rolled up tube at rest, which can coil up and retract for a lot of our species. And then when they're feeding, it extracts and is able to extract sweet nectar from a lot of blooming, flowering plants. We have sponging mouth parts. Classic example of this is with a lot of our fly species. And we can see up close what this modified mouth part can look like. And at the end, it's modified to act as like a sponge. So when it hits a particular surface, it can absorb different liquids. Talking about antennae, the two antennae on top of an insect head. We have all these fancy words on the screen, but this is just a different way to describe different forms of our antenna. And so we can see some of the diversity here. And when we're learning these different names, it's can be helpful to have a reference guide like this, because some of our keys and identification guides out there will say that a particular group is known for, say, a ristate antenna. So we can use this as a reference to learn more about what these different antennae may or may not look like. And then our wings, there's a lot we can learn about an insect from its wings. We can look at shape, color, texture. The patterns of the wing venation can be really important for identifying butterfly and moth species. The presence or absence of hooks in certain areas. How many pairs or maybe no wings present for an insect. And where the wings are held at rest can also be key for identification as well. And just here are some examples. We'll look at this for our different main orders of insects of what these wings can look like, especially comparing our front pair of wings to our hind pair of wings if we have those two pairs. And then our legs. So our legs can have different arrangements of different parts. The main parts that we'll see include the coxa, trochanter, femur, tibia, and then the tarsus. And so these are all, again, fancy terms, No one expects you to memorize these, but something to be aware of that our leg is divided up into different sections. And if we have a microscope to work with and we want to get more into insect identification, we'd be zooming in on the leg for some of our species to take a look at the number of, say, tarsomeres, the different segments in our tarsus we can see down at the bottom, maybe even looking at the arrangement of our tarsal claw at the very end of our insect's foot. So different things that we can look at, especially when we get into species identification. And then generally we can look at color, length, shape, size, and even the presence or absence of different spines. And just like with our mouth parts, how they have evolved depending on the function that a species needs, this can be the case for a lot of our legs as well. Some legs adapted more for swimming, some maybe more adapted for grasping its prey. And so this shows us that we have all these different distinguishing traits we can begin to observe and look at when we take a look at our different insect species to help us with our identification. Now, before we delve into the different insect orders, learning how to identify those and distinguish them from each other, it's important to note about different insect life cycles. Now, we won't delve into immature identification today, so the immature stages of our insects, that could be a whole nother talk. We're going to mainly focus on identifying adult stages. But we're going to come across immature stages when we're out in our green spaces, and sometimes that's all we'll come across. So I will be referencing the different insect life cycle each of our groups will have, so you know what type of immature stage you might be looking at or looking for. So things with our insects that have a holometabolous, also known as a complete metamorphosis, they're going to go through a life cycle that includes an egg stage, a larval stage, a pupa, and then their adult stage, versus our insects with our hemimetabolous or incomplete or gradual metamorphosis. They are not going to have a larval stage. They have an egg. They have typically several nymphal or immature stages as they grow bigger and bigger and bigger, molting as they reach their adult stage. So just important things to note. We'll reference this throughout today. And then you can know if the immature stage of this group of insects is going to be a larva or if it's going to be a nymph. So a smaller version typically of what that adult will look like. So let's get into our common insect groups and traits. And if we haven't been referencing our handout already, this is a great time to pick it up. We did have a few questions at the top, so my apologies for not queuing this earlier. Mine came out really small, my printer for some reason, so hopefully yours is a little bit larger. But we can see if we have our handout with us, can help us with taking notes. I included some of the drawings that will be in today's presentation for you to label. This is just an optional guide if you want some prompts for note taking. So yeah, if you don't have it, no worries. We can be sure you get one after today's presentation if you would like. So returning to our different taxonomic hierarchy levels, we're going to be talking about our different orders. So there's more insect orders than these 6 we see here, but these are some key and common ones we're going to delve into today, learning about identifying them. So our first order is called Coleoptera, and this is commonly referred to as our beetles. So looking at adult identification characteristics, their mouth parts, they have chewing mouth parts, as we can see here. Some are very visible, like we can see with this particular beetle, and some aren't as visible, like with our ladybugs. Typically hidden, we can't really see the mandibles as well, but all of our beetles do have these chewing mandibulate mouth parts, so well-developed mandibles. A tricky one is our weevils sometimes. So weevils are a type of beetle, as we can see here. They typically have an elongated frons or rostrum coming out of the front of their face, almost looks like a long nose. But we don't want to mistake this for a straw-like mouth part. And you can see why here in just a second with our acorn weevil, for instance. This is just an elongation of the front of their face, and at the end of that elongation is a chewing mouth part, believe it or not. And we can see a scanning electron micrograph on the bottom right to show In red, the two mandibles that they use for chewing. And as we learned in last month's class, our weevils typically chew on the margins of our plant leaves, which we have margins notched, which makes sense, right? They have this really long frond sometimes, chewing mouth part at the end. And so that's where they are reaching on the plants, especially the leaf tissue. So don't be tripped up or tricked by our weevils with to have that really long elongation of their face. This is still a chewing mouth part, not a piercing sucking one. Now with our wings, this is a very distinguishing trait for our beetles. They have hard or leathery front wings, and then their hind pair of wings are membranous. So this is unique for our beetles. So beetles have this hard or leathery front or top pair of wings, which we call elytra. We may have heard this term before. This elytra has no veins, meets in a straight line down the back when they're held at rest, and they cover the hind wings at rest as well. So those membranous wings are folded up underneath this elytra at the top pair. And so our photo on our right, we have a lady beetle species. We can see on the far right, the lady beetle at rest. We only see the elytra, the top pair of wings. And then when those wings are unfolded, we can now begin to see that bottom membranous pair. So membranous is typically more see-through. Sometimes they're a little bit darker, like we see in this photo here. But they're membranous. We can see the venation typically, and a little bit more see-through, as I said. These bottom pairs of wings are a little bit longer than the front pair, which is why they typically fold up nice and neat underneath the top pair when they're at rest. And so we can point out the elytra versus our membranous hind pair of wings. Here we can see a Japanese scarab beetle. So we can see those elytra coming at rest with meeting in a straight line down the center of the back. And here's an example coleoptera life cycle to note that they are holometabolists. So they have a larval immature stage. Now, not a lot of people know what a baby ladybug or larval ladybug looks like. A great thing to teach people about and to recognize, because ladybugs are beneficial predators out in our landscape. They eat prey at both the adult and the larval stage. So that's really cool. And for something to reference later, the different damage categories and types that we learned last week, these are the ones that can be done by our beetles, our coleopterans. Next, going into our Diptera order, which are true flies. We have our adult identification characteristics. We can see the mouth parts can vary, the antenna can vary. Our wings are going to be one of our key traits we'll look at, and then our legs can also vary with their form and function. We'll take a look at some examples of mouth parts. One classic one is this sponging mouth part that we saw earlier. Some examples of different common names of flies that have this sponging mouth part include things like house flies, fruit flies, syrphid flies, which are beneficial pollinators, and blowflies. But flies could also have a piercing, sucking mouth part. Classic example are mosquitoes, other things like horse flies, deer flies, black flies, and robber flies, like we can see on the screen here. Really cool predators. So they have a more developed proboscis-like mouth part that they use to pierce and extract liquids from prey, so other insects. Now taking a look at the wings. This is a great one to know if we don't already, especially for flies that look like the one on our screen, our syrphid fly. A lot of people mistake them for bees. They have a very similar coloration. They fly around flowers collecting nectar, but you will know that to differentiate our flies from, say, our bees and other wasps, flies have one pair of wings versus our bees and our wasps have two pairs of wings. So flies have only two wings total. This hind pair of wings is not fully developed. They're modified to be what's called halteres. And we'll zoom in on what these halteres look like. And they act as little gyroscopes to help with flight and body orientation as this fly is moving around. They only have one pair of fully developed wings. We can go back. Sure. Now, this one pair of wings is membranous. They don't have any scales on them. They're not hard and leathery like our beetle wings. They are membranous, and you can see typically venation in those wings. Here's an example life cycle of a fly. This is for our fungus gnats. So we can see they have a whole metabolist complete metamorphosis with that larval and pupal stage. Here's some examples of different damage types and categories for our dipterans. Next, we'll get into Hemiptera, our true bugs. So if you are an insect nerd, you want to be accurate, you will only call insects in this order bugs. So if you call a beetle a bug, technically not correct, but it is a common name. So we're not necessarily being scientific when we're calling things by their common names. But people always love to nerd out that we shouldn't be calling ladybird beetles bugs because they're beetles. Now you'll learn that we do have a group that are called true bugs, our hemipterans, and there are a lot of different species that we'll learn about. So these are things we can call bugs if we want to be a little more accurate. And there are so many different hemipterans that we will be zooming down a half step on some suborders. This is going to help us to differentiate different hemipterans because there is such a diversity in their morphology that it's hard to distinguish different traits for just Hemiptera specifically. So we're going to delve into suborders, and these are the 3 suborders for Hemiptera. Some funky names. We have Heteroptera, Achenorhyncha, and Sternarhyncha. So you can impress your friends if you want. Next gathering, you can bring up these suborder and order names. They're kind of fun to learn. It's like a different language. So before we go into these suborders, we'll talk about broadly hemipterans, our main order, and all hemipterans have a piercing, sucking mouth part, with our other traits varying. You can see this with our example stink bug on our right, straw-like mouth part coming down from the front of the face, sometimes mistaken for another leg or appendage. A lot of our hemipterans will hold the straw-like mouth part down the center of our body at rest. So sometimes we need to flip that bug over to really view that mouth part. See it there at the front of the face. And then here's a spotted lanternfly. Really important to note that spotted lanternflies have a piercing, sucking mouth part. They cannot physically chew plants. A lot of misinformation out there that they're chewing plants or leaves. They can't do this. They have a straw-like mouth part, not a chewing mouth part. And so we're going to delve into our first suborder of Heteroptera, which includes things like stink bugs, lace bugs, assassin bugs, box elder bugs. Now, insects in this suborder of Heteroptera have a very unique front pair of wings or top pair of wings. We call this the hemielytra, and it is half leathery and half membranous, so pretty unique. We'll take a look at our diagram on the right, and we can see the hemielytra, the top portion, and we can see the leathery area, the part closer to the insect's body, versus the part further away from the body, the membranous part of the top pair of wing. When these wings are held at rest, they form a X, folding over one on top of the other, versus our beetles when they hold down a straight line down the center of the back. These top wings will fold over one another, and we'll see this in the next photo. The wings lie flat along the body at rest. We'll see the difference between maybe a more roof-like orientation with our other suborders, so flatly against the body. And these hind or back pair of wings are membranous and folded under the top pair of wings. So let's take a look at a photo of a heteropteran. So we can see here on our right, we'll begin to point out these top pair of wings, these hemielytra. We can see the more leathery portion here, with orange and black, and then the all black portion, we see a lot of different veins. This is the membranous part. Now, if we can look closely, we can see this top left wing, and we're looking at it from this point of view, is folded over the bottom right wing at the top. We can see that outlined here. The blue outlined is the wing that's on top of the top pair, and the yellow wing, still one of the top pair of wings, is folded underneath. And this is where we get this designation of an X forming on top. This can be more easily seen with different insects. As you can imagine, the coloration can matter of the wings for seeing this a little bit more easily. Here we have a stink bug. We can see that hemelytra with the top pair of wing, and then the hind pair fully membranous. Okay, next suborder, Achenorhyncha, things like our spotted lanternflies, plant hoppers, frog hoppers, leaf hoppers, cicadas. So Achenorhynchans, piercing sucking mouthparts like all our hemipterans in this order. They typically have short bristle-like antennae. Their wings, when held at rest, are roof-like over the body, so almost like a tent or a roof. And then their legs have 3 tarsal segments. So this is if we're delving into more specific identification. We have magnification like a microscope, so just something to note. So we can see the diagram on our right where you can see the short bristle-like antenna, and then from this orientation, we can see the wings held roof-like at rest versus lying flat on the body like our heteropterans. So we can see this with our cicada, for instance, roof-like orientation at rest. We have our flatted citrus plant hopper here. What we'll see with our Achenorhynchans, the texture of the wings can vary, but they're going to be uniform. So we don't have the half leathery, half membranous like our heteropterans, but we have a uniform texture, or however we want to describe it, for that top pair of wings. Now we have Sternorhyncha, things like our aphids, scales, whiteflies, mealybugs, and so on. We still have those piercing sucking mouth parts. The antennae are typically more long and thread-like compared to bristle and short when they are present. And when wings are present, not all Sternorhynchans have wings, but when they are there, they are held roof-like at rest over the body, just like our Achenorhynchans. And their legs are 1 to 2 tarsal segments if we're zooming in on that leg area. Here are some examples. Now, I will say with our Sternorhynchans, there is a vast diversity in morphology, form, and function. So these traits can vary quite a bit by family, and we'll see in some of our examples. The first being our Sternorhynchon of aphids, typically very small. So we can see on our top right a finger for comparison. We can see those long thread-like antennae. We have things like whiteflies. Now they have flies in the name, but a little trick is if the common name, we don't have a space between, say, fly or bug, that means it's not a true fly. So whiteflies are not flies, they are a true bug. So that's why we kind of squish those two words together as a trick there. So we can see zoomed in, whiteflies are also very small, and then a zoomed out picture to see how what their size comparison can be. And something that's very different are things like scale insects, where we do have a really small, typically flying male, but the females are sessile once they begin to settle down in their adult stage, and they can take on very different textures, shapes, and colors. This is an adult white peach scale on our bottom right, and each of those little circles or discs is an individual adult female scale. She will stay there with a straw-like mouth part, feeding for the rest of her life, will not be moving. So there's lots of different scale species, and they are a Sternorhynchon. Here's an example of a hemipteran life cycle for brown marmorated stink bugs. So they have hemimetabolous incomplete or gradual metamorphosis. So they do not have a larval or pupal stage. They have nymphal stages, which molt, shed their exoskeleton, get larger, 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 till they reach their adult stage. There are some damage categories and types for our hemipterans. Next, we have Hymenoptera, moving along. So Hymenoptera includes things like wasps, bees, ants, and sawflies. Mouth parts can vary, the antenna can vary. Wings, we have 2 pairs of membranous wings. We'll take a look at those, and the legs can also vary. So here we'll look at the wings. On our right, we have an example, typical Western honeybee, one of our non-native bees. And we can see those two pairs of fully membranous wings. Now we see the top pair here and then the bottom pair. Now sometimes these wings can be very close together because they can be hooked with tiny hooks called hemuli. And these tiny hooks will hook the front and the hind pair together to move together as they're flying. And so that may be why when we're looking at a particular hymenopteron that it looks like just one wing together, but they're actually two wings. We have that top and that bottom pair. The front pair are typically a little bit larger or longer than the hind pair of wings, so something to observe. Another example, this is a parasitic wasp called an ichneumon. We can see those larger top pair of wings versus our bottom pair of wings, both fully membranous. You can see that venation pattern. And then we can differentiate things like sawflies, which may be a new term or group of wasps that we are learning about. And again, we notice the term flies in that name, but it's not a space between saw and fly. So it isn't a true fly, it is a wasp. And sawflies have a broad waist. Waist, we can say, a connection between the body regions. And so this belongs to a suborder called Symphyta, which is our more primitive wasps. So older age wasps from primitive times. And so we call these our sawflies generally. And then on our right, we can see even with bumblebees, it doesn't look like they have a narrow waist, but if we zoom in closely, we can see a narrowing right here where my cursor is on the screen. And so these belong to a suborder called Apocrita. So things like our ants, bees, and wasps, which have this narrow waist connection. Here's an example of our wasp holometabolous life cycle with the larval and pupal stage, and some example damage categories and types. Next, we have lepidopterans, our moths, and our butterflies. Mouth parts, when present, are typically siphoning, where we have a coiled proboscis. The antennae can vary. The wings, we have two pairs of scaly wings, and the legs can vary. So we'll take a look at that coiled proboscis with our example butterfly. So one of our hawk moths here with that long proboscis getting some nectar. And then we can zoom in to see the scales on our wings. And these scales are like arranged like little shingles on a roof to create the color or the pattern that we see. Typically that reflects light to give the sense of color and pattern for our different moth and butterfly wings. So something really cool to see. If you haven't seen this under a microscope, I highly recommend taking a look, or there's lots of really cool photos online to see these scales. And there's a lot of cool research going on to learn from scale arrangement to inform maybe new clothing items in terms of maybe pattern, color, weather resistance, and so on. So something really cool to check out. So both the top and the hind pair of wings will have these scales on them. Bodies of moths and wings will also have these scales. So it's like little hair-like structures. The antenna can vary, generally more differentiating things like butterflies, skippers, and moths. We can see that our butterflies have a knob at the end of their antenna, our skippers are hooked, and then our moths are typically straight with some variation, like we have feather-like ones or just completely straight. And then quickly, a lot of people will mistaken sawfly, which we learned is a wasp larva, for caterpillars. So we look on our screen, which one's the caterpillar, which one's the sawfly. So the top one is a caterpillar, the bottom one is a sawfly. If we had more time, I would have given you more time to guess. But here's a little chart for you to learn more about this. We can see that we're looking at number of prolegs on our larva, as well as if we have a microscope, looking at if there's crochets or hooks present on these prolegs to differentiate our caterpillars from our sawfly wasp larva. Just a quick note as we're moving along, an example monarch butterfly life cycle, as well as some example damage types and categories. Next, we have Thysanoptera thrips. Another trick, the singular form of thrips is thrips. So there's no such thing as a thrip. Thrips, always thrips, even if we just have one. Really small insect. They have what's called rasping sucking mouth parts. So similar to piercing sucking, but not quite. They will typically rasp plant tissue as they're going along, as we saw with our damaged type of streaking. Their antennae are short with 4 to 9 trapezoidal segments. That's pretty unique. They have 2 pairs of wings when they are present with distinct hairy fringe, as we can see in our drawing on our right, and 1 to 2 tarsal segments. Now, since thrips are very small, a lot of people will identify them by putting them on a slide and looking at them under a scope. So hand lens is very helpful here when we're looking at these particular insects. They have an elongated body that typically ends in a point. We have an example here of a Cuban laurel thrip, more of a darker coloration. And then for size reference, we can see some onion thrips on this onion flower. So each of these little elongated insects here is an individual thrips. Again, hand lens, very handy. Here's an example life cycle. They have a little bit more of a complex, we call it, or intermediate metamorphosis, which is almost in between our incomplete and complete metamorphosis. So they're a little bit weird with their life cycle, but we can see an example here as they go through larval stages and a pupal stage to reach an adult. Here's some examples of damage categories and types. And then last but not least, we're going to reverse back. So we're not talking about an insect right now. We're talking about an arachnid in a subclass called Acari, which includes things like mites, which are common pests in our green spaces. So mite adult identification, we have, instead of 3 main body regions like our insects, we have 2 main body regions. Typically 1 visible one, especially since mites can be very tiny. Very small, less than a millimeter, typically in size, oval or tapeworm shaped. We have 6 to 8 legs total, depending on the life stage. Adults of our mites will have 8 legs. Wingless, and their mouth parts are usually piercing sucking with the modified chelicera. So if we know about our arachnids, they have chelicera. And so with our mites, they're modified to have a piercing sucking type function. So we can see some examples on our right, some diagrams of 2 main types of mites. We have spider mites and our Areophyta, which are more of this tapered, elongated shape. Here's an example of spider mite life cycle. And then here's some size reference here, what spider mites will look like on, say, basil leaves. In spider mites, a good note to know that their presence, since they can be so small, is the presence of webbing or silk webbing. Typically, especially our spider mites will have this silk webbing. And so we can see some of these mites here. They almost look like tiny spiders amongst this webbing on basil leaves. And so here's some examples of the damage they can cause with that piercing, sucking chelicera. And with that, we've gone through our major insect groups as well as our mite group of Acari, learning about different traits we can look for. And this is a great place to start our identification journey, to be able to look at an insect and to learn and know what type of order it belongs to. This is going to help us along the way, building our skills and to begin to narrow down even more and more on what that particular insect is. So we'll conclude with some identification tools. I know we are running low on time, so I did have this practice identification I'll throw up on the screen here. We'll take a moment. With this example insect, we can see we have luckily photos of different angles. So an important tip is if we're working with a client or if we're taking photos ourselves, getting as many angles as we can. As we've learned, we can't always see all the parts, especially the mouth part, from different angles. So when you're looking at this insect, take a look at the mouth parts, the antenna, the wings, and the legs, and maybe we have an idea of what order it may belong to. Take another moment or two. I'll give you a hint. We're looking especially at the mouth part and the wings. So what we have here is a hemipteran, a true bug, specifically the suborder of Heteroptera. It's a little bit difficult to see with the coloration. Again, an important note that clear photos can be really important because when we get a blurry photo, we can't see all these traits super easily. But with this particular insect, which is called a red-shouldered bug, we have black wings. So it's hard to see this hemelytra that's present for our Heteropterans. We have that leathery portion and then the membranous portion that cross over one another, the top pair of wings, to form that X, holding the wings at rest flat along the body. And we also see this piercing, sucking mouth part on our right photo coming down from the front of the face. So all pointing us to order Hemiptera, suborder Heteroptera. Some identification tips to end us off. Observing the insect from as many angles as possible, getting those clear photos. Utilizing size references can be really important, especially for photos. Using things like coins, rulers can be really helpful. Record where the insect was found, whether that be indoors, outdoors, on a particular plant, where on the plant. Observing distinguishing traits, as we learned, like main body regions, mouth parts, number of wings or no wings. And always utilizing credible resources. There's a lot of misidentified insects on the internet, so don't always trust your Google image searches. Make sure to check the reference, and that is a credible source. You can always utilize Ask Extension. This is a free service. We have it through University of Maryland Extension. It's an online forum where you can submit photos to us, and we can help you with your identification. Key takeaways from today's presentation. A lot of information to absorb. I hope you've learned something. You've gotten a little bit more curious about insects if you aren't already. So insects are a type of animal related to other arthropods like millipedes, mites, and spiders. Insects are distinguished by their 3 main body regions, 2 antennae, and 6 legs. Insects play vital roles in our ecosystems, and they need our help and support. Insect identification is important to effectively and sustainably managing pests and plant damage, so a key part of plant diagnostics. Distinguishing traits like mouth parts, antennae, wings, and legs can be used to differentiate key insect groups like our main 6 insect orders and 1 subclass for our mites that we learned about today. Gather as much information as needed, just like with our first class, we learned about plant diagnostics. The more information, the better generally, to help with your identification, always utilizing those credible resources. Credible resources. Please, there's so much misinformation out there. So thank you again for joining us, for spending your lunch hour with all of us as we learn together about plant diagnostics and insect identification. Before you leave, if you can hang on for another minute or two, I'm going to launch the post quiz. It's going to look familiar. Another knowledge check-in for yourself. So that is just launching now. So if you see it on your screen, fill it out if you can. I appreciate it. If not, no worries. I hope to see you next month. And if you would like to stick around, I am more than happy to answer any questions that were posted in the Q&A, or you can post them now.
Great job, Maddie. You're getting a lot of compliments in the chat as always. We've got a couple questions in the Q&A. Back when we were talking about Hemiptera, you mentioned lace bugs. How are they different from lace wings?
Ooh, good question. So lace wings belong to a different insect order that we didn't talk about today. This insect order is called Neuroptera. And this is called, and generally called, net-winged. And so our neuropterans have longer net-like membranous wings with really long antennae, and they do not have these piercing, sucking mouth parts like our hemipterans do. So our lace bugs, they have very similar names. I know I confuse their common names quite a bit: lace bugs, lace wings. Lacewings are also a lot larger at their adult form. Lacewings are fairly small. They have really cool, almost stained glass-like wings, so something to look up um, closer in photos online because in real life they're really tiny, found on the undersides of plants, and these are piercing, sucking herbivores, so they're feeding on plant juice. Our lace wings are predators, especially at their larval stage, and as adults are feeding on nectar. So very different life cycles. The common names can really trip us up, which is why it can be important to start to begin to learn the different scientific names for even just the insect groups we're talking about today, because that can help us in our mind to learn about different distinguishing traits for differentiating our different groups. A great question.
A couple questions about butterflies. How do skippers differ from butterflies?
Good question. There is a conversation online of whether we should call skipper or between scientists as well, whether we should call skippers butterflies or not. A lot of people will categorize skippers as a type of butterfly. Some people will characterize them completely separately. So we have butterflies, skippers, and moths. But they are a different type. We're typically, a lot of our skippers, again, have that hook at the end of their antenna. They hold their wings a little bit differently at rest depending on the species. But so it's not distinct. And I would also like to look into it more about the current research that's going on, maybe looking at their genetics to see how they relate. Uh, but right now, a lot of the time we're calling them a type of butterfly, but you could also differentiate them. It helps to kind of point out the diversity within our order of Lepidoptera.
Interesting. I did not know that. How do you differentiate moths from butterflies?
Moths from butterflies, yes. So typically, more commonly, an easy trait that we can see is antenna, if the antenna are visible. So our moths won't have that bulbous type end at the end like a lot of our butterflies do. A lot of our male moths will have that plumose or featherly like antenna. Also, a lot of our moths are typically more thicker bodied. And so it really depends. Again, we have such a diversity. I'm sure we can find a butterfly that looks exactly like a moth and a moth that looks exactly like a butterfly. And their traits to differentiate them, we need a microscope to see. But generally, a really good trait is to look at the antenna to help with that differentiation.
And last question, are there different sizes of butterflies?
Yes, we can have some really tiny butterflies. One I love to see, especially flying around this time of year, those really small blue butterflies. I'm blinking on their common name now, but they can be really small, about the size of a penny or so. A lot of our smaller butterflies can be mistaken for moths. A lot of our smaller moths can be mistaken for butterflies. So the size in terms of different insect species varies quite a bit. And that's why a lot of our species go unnoticed because these really small ones, especially ones that can camouflage and blend in with their environment, are harder to spot and to see. But I will say the more you learn about insects and get curious, I like to call it gaining the sight. You get to notice more and more of these insects around you. I don't know, it can be kind of a startling thing at first, but I think it's really cool. Of course, I'm an insect nerd because I'm biased, but I can't go on a walk now without stopping every couple seconds and noticing some new insect out there.
All right, that looks like all our questions answered.
Thank you all for joining us again today. Feel free to reach out with any questions. I did get a couple emails with photos of different plant damage categories and types. Again, as a reminder, send as many photos as you can in terms of angles, zooming in, zooming out, because a zoomed in blurry photo, I unfortunately cannot tell you much. So it's important to get really good photos with more information. I will be reaching out soon in terms of having this recording link, maybe some other resources and references, some of my favorite identification tools online, things like iNaturalist and Bug Guide. and maybe some fun Halloween inspired insects if we want to learn more about those. There's some really cool black and orange ones. So enjoy the rest of your October, and I look forward to seeing you in November. Bye, everyone.